Did you know that mermaids, those mythical creatures of the sea, might actually have a surprising connection to the Bible? That's right, these enchanting beings aren't just legends from folklore. They have roots in biblical history that few people know about. What if I told you there's an ancient deity, half man and half fish, worshipped by nations in the Bible, and his story is far darker than you can imagine? Stay tuned, because today we're diving deep into the mysterious truth behind mermaids and their biblical origins. Make sure to subscribe and hit that like button. You won't want to miss this. Throughout history, mermaids have captured the imaginations of people from various cultures, with their alluring beauty and mysterious nature inspiring countless legends and myths. These mythical creatures, half human and half fish, have been depicted as both enchanting and dangerous, often symbolizing temptation and the unknown. But have you ever wondered if there's any mention of such beings in the Bible? Surprisingly, the scriptures do contain references that bear resemblance to these aquatic figures, but not in the way you might think. Let's begin by addressing the mythological representation of mermaids as charming, seductive beings who lured sailors to their doom. In ancient folklore, mermaids were often seen as enchanting yet dangerous creatures, using their beauty and siren-like voices to lead men astray. But when we turn to the Bible, we discover that the spiritual implications of these figures are far more sinister and complex. While the Bible doesn't directly mention mermaids as we know them, it does describe entities that share similar attributes, figures that represent false gods and deceptions, leading people away from the one true God. This is where we enter into the realm of biblical symbolism. Just as in folklore, where mermaids symbolize distractions that pull us from safety, in the Bible, similar figures are portrayed as spiritual dangers. One such figure is Dagon, an ancient deity worshipped by the Philistines. Dagon is depicted as a half-man, half-fish god, an image strikingly similar to what we now think of as mermaids or mermen. His role as a false god led the Philistines into idolatry and away from the worship of the true God, symbolizing the temptation to follow alluring but dangerous paths. The mythological beauty and allure of mermaids can be compared to the deceptions of false gods that the Bible warns against. Throughout Scripture, God repeatedly instructs His people to avoid the seductive power of idol worship, which, like the siren call of mermaids, pulls individuals away from their devotion to God. In Deuteronomy 4 verse 19, God warns the Israelites not to be seduced by the stars or the heavenly bodies into worshiping false gods, reminding us that distractions often come cloaked in beauty and fascination. As we explore these biblical connections, we begin to see that mermaids, in their symbolic form, represent more than just myths. They embody the spiritual temptations and idolatries that lead people astray. And while today's culture may view these beings as harmless fantasy, the Bible offers a deeper perspective on how such alluring figures can be manifestations of greater spiritual struggles. Just as sailors were warned about the dangers of mermaids, the Bible cautions us against the dangers of idolatry and false worship, drawing parallels between the temptations of old and those that persist today. The fascination with mermaids is not just a cultural phenomenon, but a spiritual metaphor for the distractions and false promises that can captivate our hearts. In this way, the Bible's portrayal of false gods like Dagon serves as a timeless warning, one that remains relevant in our modern world. These ancient stories and myths, while seemingly distant from our everyday lives, carry profound lessons about where we place our trust and what we allow to guide us. In the same way that mermaids and folklore led sailors to ruin, the Bible shows us that idols, whether ancient or modern, have the power to lead us away from God's truth. This is the deeper, often overlooked connection between the myth of mermaids and the spiritual dangers described in Scripture. And as we continue to explore the biblical accounts of Dagon and other false deities, it becomes clear that these stories are not just relics of the past, but living reminders of the ongoing battle for our devotion and faith. In the Bible, one of the most fascinating and pivotal figures connected to the mythology of mermaids is the ancient god Dagon. Dagon was worshipped by the Philistines, a coastal people who played a significant role in Israel's history, often standing as fierce adversaries to the nation. What makes Dagon particularly interesting is his depiction as a half-man, half-fish deity, which immediately evokes images of mythical mermaids and mermen. This connection between Dagon and the sea, as well as his half-fish representation, offers a striking biblical origin to the aquatic myths that have fascinated cultures for centuries. Dagon's worship is introduced to us in the Bible through several key events. His most prominent mention is in the story of Samson, found in the book of Judges. The Philistines, after capturing Samson, held a great celebration in their temple to honor Dagon for delivering their enemy into their hands. The festivities were grand, with thousands of people gathered, and Samson, once mighty, was humiliated and bound. In Judges 16 verse 23, we read, "Now the lords of the Philistines assembled to offer a great sacrifice to Dagon their god and to rejoice, for they said, 'Our God has given Samson, our enemy, into our hands.'" This event is more than just a celebration of military victory. It underscores the spiritual significance of the clash between the one true God, Yahweh, and the false gods worshipped by Israel's enemies. Dagon, as the god of the Philistines, is a prime example of the kind of false deity that led entire nations astray, promoting idolatry and rebellion against the God of Israel. In this sense, Dagon represents not just a mythological figure, but a real spiritual threat to the people of God. The worship of Dagon was not limited to this one event. The Bible mentions him again in 1 Samuel 5, where the Ark of the Covenant, Israel's most sacred object, symbolizing God's presence, was captured by the Philistines and placed in the temple of Dagon in Ashdod. This moment, however, leads to one of the Bible's most dramatic divine interventions. The morning after the ark was placed next to Dagon's statue, the Philistines found their idol toppled face down before the Arkansas. They set the statue back up, only for it to fall again the next morning, this time with its head and hands broken off, leaving only the trunk of the idol. This powerful scene reveals more than just a physical defeat. It is a symbolic dethroning of Dagon, showing that Yahweh is the supreme God and no false idol, no matter how revered or feared, can stand in his presence. The fall of Dagon's statue represents the spiritual impotence of false gods when faced with the living God of Israel. This story is a dramatic illustration of the futility of idolatry, as Dagon, who was supposed to protect and empower his people, was powerless against the Ark of the Covenant. Dagon's fish-like form also carries a deeper meaning within the context of his worship. In ancient Mesopotamian culture, deities associated with water were often linked to creation, fertility, and the sustenance of life, reflecting the people's dependence on the sea for survival. However, in biblical terms, the worship of such deities represents a turning away from the Creator toward the creation. Romans 1 verse 25 warns against such practices, saying that people exchanged the truth of God for a lie and worshipped and served created things rather than the Creator, who is forever praised. The fall of Dagon, therefore, isn't just a story about a statue breaking. It is a spiritual lesson about the consequences of putting trust in anything other than God. The Philistines' reverence for Dagon, much like the mythological mermaids of various cultures, symbolized the allure of worldly temptations and false promises. Just as sailors in folklore were lured by the song of mermaids, the Philistines were drawn into the seductive yet hollow worship of a false god. Dagon, though once feared and celebrated, is ultimately shown in Scripture to be nothing more than an idol, powerless in the face of Yahweh's might. This biblical account serves as a stark reminder of the danger of idolatry, a theme that echoes throughout the Bible and remains relevant to this day. The lesson is clear. No matter how captivating or mighty a false god may seem, it cannot compare to the true power and authority of the one true God. In the grand narrative of the Old Testament, the battle between the God of Israel and the pagan gods of surrounding nations forms a significant spiritual backdrop. Among these false deities, Dagon plays a key role, representing not only the Philistine opposition to Israel, but also the larger spiritual warfare between the forces of darkness and the true God. Dagon's presence in the Old Testament is not simply a cultural or historical reference. It symbolizes the deep spiritual conflict between Yahweh, the living God, and the idols that led entire nations into deception and rebellion. Understanding Dagon's role in this battle helps us grasp the theological depth of these stories and their relevance to the larger spiritual reality. The Philistines, who worshiped Dagon, were not just enemies of Israel in terms of territory and politics. Their devotion to Dagon reflected their spiritual separation from Yahweh, and their conflicts with Israel were often seen through the lens of spiritual warfare. Dagon, with his half-man, half-fish form, was a representation of fertility, the sea, and power over nature, things that the Philistines believed gave them strength and dominance. But for Israel, their God was not merely another deity in a pantheon. Yahweh was the creator, sovereign over all, and the only one worthy of worship. The tension between these two belief systems created a constant friction, manifesting in the battles between Israel and the Philistines. One of the clearest examples of this spiritual battle is found in the story of Samson, particularly in Judges 16 verses 23 to 30. Samson, a judge chosen by God to deliver Israel from the Philistines, becomes entangled in a series of personal and moral failures, culminating in his capture by the Philistines. After binding him and gouging out his eyes, they hold a grand celebration in the temple of Dagon, praising their God for delivering Samson into their hands. This scene of mockery and idolatrous triumph reflects the Philistines' belief that Dagon had defeated not just Samson, but the God of Israel as well. They equated their military victory with a spiritual one, believing that Dagon's power had triumphed over Yahweh's. However, the Bible presents a different reality. While the Philistines praised Dagon, Samson, despite his flaws, turns to Yahweh in a final prayer of repentance and asks for the strength to bring down the temple. What happens next is a dramatic reversal. Samson pulls down the pillars of the temple, collapsing the structure and killing more Philistines in his death than in his entire life. This moment is more than just a physical victory. It represents Yahweh's ultimate authority over Dagon and the false gods of the Philistines. While Dagon seemed to have the upper hand, God's power was revealed through the humbling of both Samson and the Philistine people. The role of Dagon in the spiritual warfare of the Old Testament is further emphasized in 1 Samuel 5, where the Philistines capture the Ark of the Covenant after defeating Israel in battle. They place the Ark in Dagon's temple, assuming it to be a trophy of their God's victory over Yahweh. But once again, the true spiritual reality is revealed when Dagon's statue is found fallen before the Ark, his head and hands broken off. This vivid image of Dagon's decapitated statue lying face down before the Ark of the Covenant is a symbolic proclamation of Yahweh's supremacy. Despite the Philistines' military success, their God was powerless in the presence of Israel's God. These stories not only highlight Dagon's role in the spiritual battles of the Old Testament, but also reveal a deeper theological truth. The struggle between Yahweh and the false gods was not merely about territorial disputes or military conquests. It was about the hearts and souls of people. Throughout the Bible, idolatry is seen as a primary threat to the covenant relationship between God and his people. The worship of false gods, like Dagon, represents humanity's tendency to turn away from the Creator and seek security in created things. This idolatry leads to spiritual blindness, oppression, and ultimately destruction. Dagon's role in the Old Testament also serves as a warning to us today. While we may not bow down to statues or idols of fish-like gods, the spiritual battle continues in the form of modern-day idols, anything that takes the place of God in our hearts. Just as the Philistines believed that Dagon could give them power, prosperity, and victory, people today often put their trust in money, success, relationships, or status to fulfill their deepest needs. But the Bible reminds us, again and again, that only Yahweh, the living God, can satisfy and sustain us. In this light, Dagon's fall before the ark is not just a historical moment, but a profound symbol of the inevitable collapse of all false gods and idols. No matter how powerful or alluring they may seem, they cannot stand before the true God. The spiritual battle that played out in the Old Testament continues today, and the choice remains the same. Will we trust in the one true God, or will we be deceived by the false promises of idols? As we reflect on the role of Dagon in the spiritual battles of the Old Testament, we are reminded of the ongoing importance of faithfulness to God. The stories of Samson and the ark's capture challenge us to recognize the idols in our own lives and to remember that no matter the challenges or the apparent strength of the enemy, God's power and authority are absolute. Throughout the Bible, the temptation to worship false gods and idols is a recurring theme. From the early days of Israel's history, the people were continually lured away from Yahweh, the true God, and seduced by the deities of the nations surrounding them. This temptation was not just about bowing down to statues or offering sacrifices. It was deeply rooted in the human heart's desire for control, security, and gratification outside of God's will. The allure of false gods promised prosperity, fertility, and protection, but at its core, it represented a spiritual rebellion against the Creator. The story of Dagon and the Philistines is a vivid example of this dangerous temptation. But the problem of idolatry goes far beyond the ancient world. It is just as relevant today. The Israelites struggled with the temptation to worship foreign gods almost from the moment they were freed from Egypt. Despite witnessing the miraculous power of Yahweh in their deliverance, they quickly turned to worship the golden calf at Mount Sinai, an act that symbolized their desire for something tangible, something they could see and control. This incident set the tone for much of Israel's spiritual journey throughout the Old Testament. The temptation to seek security in false gods, whether it was Baal, Asherah, Dagon, or others, was ever present. The people repeatedly turned their hearts away from the one true God who had brought them out of slavery and provided for them in the wilderness. What makes idolatry so insidious is its deceptive nature. False gods promise immediate satisfaction and power, appealing to the very desires that God asks us to surrender to Him. In the case of Dagon and the Philistines, Dagon was seen as a source of fertility and success, something the Philistines believed they needed for survival and prosperity. Similarly, the Israelites were often tempted by the Canaanite gods like Baal, who was worshipped as a god of rain and fertility. In an agrarian society where rain was essential for survival, the temptation to turn to Baal in hopes of ensuring a good harvest was overwhelming. Yet, every time the Israelites gave in to this temptation, they drifted further from the covenant relationship they were meant to have with Yahweh. This is a key point in understanding the nature of idolatry. It always pulls us away from God and leads us into spiritual bondage. While worshiping Dagon or Baal may seem far removed from our modern-day context, the principles behind idolatry are the same. Anything that takes the place of God in our lives becomes an idol. It could be material wealth, success, personal relationships, or even our own self-image. Just as the Israelites struggled with the gods of their day, we are constantly faced with choices about what we will put our trust in. Will it be God? Or will it be something else that promises to fulfill our deepest desires? The Bible is clear that idolatry is not just a surface-level issue. It is a condition of the heart. In Ezekiel 14, verse 3, God says, "These men have set up idols in their hearts." This means that idolatry isn't always about physical statues or images. It's about what we allow to rule our hearts and minds. Anything we prioritize over our relationship with God becomes an idol. For the Israelites, this often meant turning to false gods for protection or prosperity. For us today, it can be the pursuit of money, status, or even technology. We may not physically bow down to a statue, but when we give our hearts to something other than God, we are, in essence, worshiping that thing. The temptation of idolatry also speaks to a lack of faith in God's provision. When the Israelites worshipped false gods like Baal or Dagon, It was often because they doubted whether Yahweh would meet their needs. This same doubt can creep into our lives. When we feel uncertain about the future, it can be tempting to place our trust in things that seem more immediate and tangible. But the Bible teaches us that these idols, like Dagon, will ultimately fall. They cannot withstand the power and authority of God, and they will always leave us feeling empty. One of the key stories that illustrates the danger of false worship is found in 1 Kings 18, where the prophet Elijah confronts the prophets of Baal on Mount Carmel. In a dramatic display of power, Elijah challenges the people of Israel to choose between Baal and Yahweh. The prophets of Baal call on their God from morning until noon, but no fire falls from heaven. Then Elijah calls upon Yahweh, and fire immediately consumes the offering on the altar, proving that Yahweh alone is the true God. This story shows the futility of idolatry. Baal, like Dagon, was powerless in the face of the living God. Yet, it also reveals the stubbornness of the human heart, as the people of Israel struggled to fully commit to Yahweh despite his overwhelming display of power. The spiritual battle between Yahweh and false gods is a theme that runs throughout the Bible. And while the idols of today may look different, the temptation remains the same. Just as Dagon was seen as a source of strength and fertility, today's idols promise success, happiness, and security. But just like Dagon, these idols are powerless to deliver what they promise. Only God can fulfill the deepest longings of our hearts. Ultimately, the temptation to worship false gods is a reminder of our need for dependence on God. The Israelites' struggle with idolatry reflected their lack of trust in God's promises, and we often face the same struggle. Yet, God's call remains the same, to turn away from idols and place our full trust in Him. When we recognize that only God can provide for our needs and guide us through life's challenges, we can resist the temptation to seek fulfillment in other places. As we consider the role of Dagon in the Old Testament, we are reminded that the battle against idolatry is one that continues today. The story of Dagon falling before the Ark of the Covenant is a powerful symbol of the ultimate victory of God over all false gods. It serves as a reminder that no matter how tempting or powerful idols may seem, they cannot stand in the presence of the true God. Dagon and Baal are two of the most infamous false gods in the Bible, and their stories are deeply intertwined with the history of ancient Israel. These gods, worshipped by the Philistines and Canaanites respectively, represent the powerful lure of idolatry and the dangers it posed to the Israelites. Interestingly, Dagon, often depicted as part man and part fish, provides a fascinating connection to the mythological concept of mermaids and sea creatures, while Baal, as a god of storms and fertility, symbolizes a broader network of pagan worship that extended throughout the ancient Near East. Together, these deities reveal a deeper spiritual battle between the forces of idolatry and the worship of the true God. Dagon, as we've seen, was worshipped as a god of grain and fertility among the Philistines. His depiction as a half-man, half-fish figure links him not only to ancient agriculture, but also to the seas. This duality of land and sea makes him a unique figure in the pantheon of false gods. In many ways, Dagon reflects the ancient fascination with sea creatures, and it's easy to see how legends of mermaids, creatures that combine human and aquatic features, could find a connection to such a deity. The idea of Dagon as a god of the sea and fertility might explain why he was so important to the Philistines, a people who lived along the coast and depended on both the land's produce and the bounty of the sea. Baal, on the other hand, was a much broader and more pervasive figure in ancient Canaanite religion. As a god of storms, rain, and fertility, Baal was worshipped across many regions, and his influence extended far beyond the borders of Canaan. Like Dagon, Baal was a deity that promised prosperity, particularly in agriculture. But Baal worship involved far more than just praying for rain. It often descended into immoral and violent rituals, including human sacrifice. This aspect of Baal worship is important to consider when we think about how these false gods and their associated legends influenced the spiritual climate of ancient Israel. The connection between Dagon and Baal is also notable because both gods represent the syncretistic nature of pagan worship in the ancient world. The Philistines, Canaanites, and other nations often blended the worship of different gods, creating a network of spiritual influences that were deeply rooted in their cultures. Dagon, the god of the Philistines, and Baal, the god of the Canaanites, were often worshipped alongside each other, with their myths and legends overlapping. In many ways, the worship of these gods mirrored the broader pagan tendency to blend religious practices and gods from different regions. This practice led to a form of idolatry that was adaptable, making it particularly dangerous to the Israelites, who were commanded by God to worship him alone. Dagon and Baal are also connected through their representation of natural forces. While Dagon was linked to the sea and fertility of the land, Baal was associated with storms and rain. Both gods were seen as providers of essential resources, whether food from the land or water from the sky. This made their worship appealing in times of need, particularly during droughts or famines, when people would turn to these deities in desperation. Yet, the Bible repeatedly shows how relying on these gods only led to destruction. The Israelites, who were often tempted to turn to Baal in hopes of securing rain for their crops, were reminded through the prophets that it was Yahweh, not Baal, who controlled the elements. The Bible also provides a powerful contrast between Yahweh and these false gods. One of the most memorable stories is the showdown between Elijah and the prophets of Baal on Mount Carmel. In this dramatic event, Elijah challenged the prophets of Baal to call down fire from their God to prove his power. Despite their frantic prayers and ritualistic self-harm, Baal remained silent. In stark contrast, when Elijah prayed to Yahweh, fire immediately fell from heaven and consumed the offering, demonstrating the undeniable power of the one true God. 1 Kings 18. This story not only exposes the futility of worshiping Baal, but also highlights the stark difference between the living God and the impotent idols of the nations. Similarly, Dagon's defeat at the hands of Yahweh is vividly depicted in the story of the Ark of the Covenant. When the Philistines captured the Ark and placed it in the temple of Dagon, the idol of Dagon was found toppled and broken before the Ark, symbolizing the supremacy of God over this false deity. 1 Samuel 5 verses 2-4. The image of Dagon, the once mighty god of the Philistines, lying broken before the ark is a profound illustration of the powerlessness of idols in the face of the true God. But the connection between Dagon and Baal goes deeper than just these stories of defeat. Both gods, and the myths surrounding them, represent the broader struggle between light and darkness, between the worship of the one true God and the temptation to turn to false gods. This struggle is not just confined to the ancient world. It continues today in various forms. Whether it's the pursuit of wealth, power, or personal success, modern idols often take on different appearances, but they are rooted in the same desires that once led people to worship Dagon and Baal. Moreover, the legends of these gods, and the myths that grew around them, highlight the spiritual consequences of turning away from God. In worshiping Dagon or Baal, people were not merely engaging in religious practices. They were aligning themselves with forces opposed to Yahweh. The Bible makes it clear that idolatry is not just a harmless religious choice. It is a spiritual betrayal that has real consequences for individuals and nations. This is why the prophets of Israel spoke so forcefully against the worship of false gods. They understood that idolatry was not just a theological issue. It was a matter of life and death, both spiritually and physically. The connection between Dagon, Baal, and other false gods, such as the legends of mermaids and sea creatures, serves as a reminder of the spiritual battle that has been raging since the beginning of time. The Bible shows us that behind these myths and legends lie real spiritual forces that seek to draw people away from God. While the allure of false gods may seem enticing, their ultimate end is destruction. Just as Dagon and Baal fell before the power of Yahweh, so too will all idols eventually crumble in the presence of the one true God. In conclusion, the stories of Dagon and Baal, and their connection to false gods like mermaids, serve as a warning to all believers. We must remain vigilant in our faith, resisting the temptation to put our trust in anything other than God. Whether it's the allure of wealth, power, or pleasure, the idols of this world will never satisfy. Only God can provide the peace, security, and fulfillment that we seek. And just as he triumphed over Dagon and Baal, he will continue to triumph over every false god that stands in opposition to his kingdom. The spiritual message behind the story of Dagon is profound and unmistakable. God is sovereign over all things, including the false gods and idols that people worship. The biblical narrative of Dagon's downfall emphasizes a central truth that echoes throughout Scripture. There is only one true God, and his power reigns supreme over all creation. When the Philistines captured the Ark of the Covenant and placed it in the temple of Dagon, they believed they had triumphed over Israel and, by extension, over Yahweh. But what follows in 1 Samuel 5 reveals the futility of such beliefs. Dagon, the revered fish god of the Philistines, was found face down, broken, and powerless before the Ark of the Lord, the very symbol of God's presence and authority. This scene was a dramatic illustration of God's sovereignty, and it serves as a reminder of his ultimate authority over all false deities. From the perspective of the Philistines, Dagon represented protection, provision, and victory. He was worshipped not only as a god of the sea and agriculture, but also as a symbol of power in war. The Philistines, much like many ancient civilizations, placed their faith in gods who were closely tied to natural forces, thinking these deities controlled the elements that influenced their daily lives, whether it was the fertility of their crops, the strength of their armies, or the bounty of the sea. By bringing the ark into Dagon's temple, the Philistines believed that Dagon had asserted his dominance over Yahweh, further reinforcing their devotion to this false god. However, the Bible turns this narrative on its head by showing the utter powerlessness of Dagon in the presence of the true God. The fact that Dagon's statue fell face down twice before the ark is not only symbolic, but deeply significant. In ancient times, bowing or falling prostrate was a sign of submission and surrender. The Bible intentionally includes this detail to show that Dagon, though worshipped as a god, was nothing more than a lifeless idol that had no power when confronted by the God of Israel. The first fall of Dagon could be seen as a warning to the Philistines, but when they set their idol back in place, unwilling to accept the reality before them, God delivered a final blow. The next morning, not only had Dagon fallen again, but his head and hands had been severed, leaving only the torso of the idol intact. In ancient cultures, beheading and the removal of hands were signs of utter defeat and humiliation. It was a powerful image of the futility of trusting in anything other than the living God. This biblical episode serves as a potent reminder for us today. In the modern world, idols may not always take the form of physical statues, but the principle remains the same. Anything that takes the place of God in our hearts, whether it be wealth, success, power, or even relationships, can become an idol. And just like Dagon, these idols will ultimately fall. The story of Dagon reminds us that no matter how much we place our trust in things other than God, they will never be able to stand in the presence of his sovereignty. They may seem powerful for a time, but eventually they will crumble, just as Dagon did. Furthermore, the story of Dagon highlights a spiritual battle that goes far beyond the physical world. The Philistines' belief that Dagon had defeated Yahweh reflects a misunderstanding that continues to this day. Thinking that God's silence or the success of the wicked means that he has been defeated or is absent. But the Bible makes it clear that God's sovereignty is never compromised. Even when the Philistines had the ark in their possession, they had not captured God. He cannot be contained, defeated, or manipulated. While the Philistines believed their God had triumphed, God's actions in the temple of Dagon show that his power is absolute and his authority extends everywhere. This theme of divine sovereignty is echoed throughout Scripture. The Psalms, for example, are filled with declarations of God's unmatched power and His supremacy over all creation. Psalm 115 verse 3 declares, "Our God is in the heavens. He does all that He pleases," emphasizing the freedom and authority of God to act according to His will. Isaiah 45 verse 5 also echoes this sentiment, where God proclaims, "I am the Lord, and there is no other. Besides me, there is no God." These passages reinforce the truth demonstrated in Dagon's fall. No matter how powerful an idol or a false god may seem, it is nothing in comparison to the true God. This story also serves as a cautionary tale for believers. The Israelites, too, struggled with the temptation to worship false gods. Time and again, they were drawn into the worship of Baal, Asherah, and other idols, often as a way of securing what they believed would be immediate blessings, rain, fertility, or military victory. But each time, these pursuits ended in failure and judgment. The story of Dagon is a reminder that God will not share His glory with another. As Isaiah 42 verse 8 says, "I am the Lord, that is my name. My glory I give to no other, nor my praise to carved idols." God's sovereignty means that He alone deserves our worship and trust, and when we turn to idols, whether ancient or modern, we are turning away from the only one who can truly provide for us. In today's world, idols might take different forms, but they are no less dangerous. The pursuit of material success, the need for approval from others, or even the desire for control in our lives can all become idols if they take precedence over our relationship with God. The message of Dagon's fall is that nothing in this world, no matter how alluring or powerful it seems, can stand against the sovereignty of God. And just as God toppled Dagon, He can and will overthrow the idols in our lives if we allow Him to take His rightful place as Lord. Ultimately, the story of Dagon is not just about the defeat of a false god. It's about the undeniable truth that God is sovereign over all. His power cannot be matched, His authority cannot be questioned, and His glory will not be shared. The fall of Dagon is a visual representation of the spiritual reality that we face every day. There is only one true God, and He alone deserves our worship, our trust, and our devotion. In every situation, we are called to remember that God is in control, and no idol or false god, no matter how grand or powerful it seems, can ever stand in His presence. In today's world, the idols we face may not look like the stone statues or ancient gods worshipped by cultures like the Philistines, but the temptation of idolatry is as strong as ever. The story of Dagon's fall in the presence of God's ark holds profound lessons for our modern age, especially in how we approach the things we value and elevate above all else. Just as the Philistines trusted in Dagon for victory and provision, people today place their trust in material wealth, social status, personal achievements, and even technology, believing these things will bring them fulfillment, security, or happiness. But just like Dagon, these modern idols are powerless in the face of God's sovereignty and incapable of delivering what they promise. One of the key takeaways from the biblical narrative of Dagon is that God will not tolerate anything that competes for His rightful place in our hearts. This isn't just an ancient warning for Israel or the Philistines. It's a timeless truth that applies to each of us. Today, idolatry may be more subtle, but it is no less dangerous. Idols can take many forms: money, success, relationships, or even personal ambitions. Anything that demands our devotion or becomes central to our identity, if it takes precedence over our relationship with God, becomes an idol. Modern idols often disguise themselves as good things. Success, for example, is something that most people strive for. Hard work and ambition are important values. But when the pursuit of success becomes all-consuming, when it starts to define who we are and dictate our choices, it can subtly replace our dependence on God. The Bible warns us about the dangers of relying on material wealth. In Matthew 6 verse 24, Jesus said, "You cannot serve both God and money." It's not that wealth or success is inherently wrong, But when these things take the place of God as the primary source of our identity and security, they become idols that control our lives. We must ask ourselves, are we trusting in our bank accounts, our jobs, or our social status more than we are trusting in God? Another significant modern idol is the relentless pursuit of pleasure and comfort. Our culture often promotes the idea that happiness comes from acquiring more, whether it's possessions, experiences, or entertainment. Social media platforms have contributed to this by constantly bombarding us with images of idealized lifestyles and perfect experiences, making it easy to feel as though we're missing out if we don't have everything others seem to enjoy. But the truth is, this endless chase for pleasure often leaves us empty and dissatisfied. The more we chase after the things the world promises will fulfill us, the more we realize they can never satisfy the deepest longings of our hearts. Ecclesiastes 5 verse 10 reminds us, "Whoever loves money never has enough. Whoever loves wealth is never satisfied with their income." The same can be said about any modern idol, whether it's possessions, achievements, or experiences. They will always fall short of bringing us true peace or joy. In addition to money and pleasure, one of the most deceptive idols of our time is the idol of self. We live in a culture that celebrates individualism and personal empowerment, often to the point of promoting self-centeredness and pride. Society encourages us to follow your heart and be your own boss, but in doing so, we can easily lose sight of our need for God. The Bible teaches us that true strength comes not from self-reliance, but from dependence on God. In 2 Corinthians 12 verse 9, Paul writes, "My grace is sufficient for you, for my power is made perfect in weakness." Yet, in a world that glorifies independence and self-sufficiency, it's easy to elevate ourselves to the status of an idol, trusting in our own abilities, our own wisdom, and our own plans, rather than submitting to God's will. Social media has also contributed to the rise of the idol of self. Platforms like Instagram, TikTok, and Facebook provide constant opportunities for people to craft and showcase their idealized selves, often leading to a cycle of comparison, envy, and a craving for validation. In a sense, people are seeking worship in the form of likes, followers, and social recognition. The Bible warns us against seeking approval from people rather than from God. Galatians 1 verse 10 says, "Am I now trying to win the approval of human beings or of God? Or am I trying to please people? If I were still trying to please people, I would not be a servant of Christ." When we live for the applause of others, we are no different from the Israelites who turned away from God to worship the idols of the surrounding nations. At the heart of idolatry is a misplaced trust. We place our hope and security in things that are temporary, things that cannot provide what only God can. Whether it's success, relationships, pleasure, or social status, these idols will always fail to meet our deepest needs. The story of Dagon reminds us that no matter how much we trust in our modern idols, they will ultimately fall. They cannot stand in the presence of the living God. As believers, we are called to examine our hearts and to rid ourselves of anything that competes with God's place in our lives. Colossians 3 verse 5 challenges us, "Put to death, therefore, whatever belongs to your earthly nature: sexual immorality, impurity, lust, evil desires, and greed, which is idolatry." Finally, what the story of Dagon teaches us is that God is patient but firm. The Philistines had the chance to recognize the futility of their idol after Dagon's first fall, yet they set him back up, refusing to acknowledge the truth. It was only after Dagon's total collapse that they were forced to confront reality. In our lives, God may allow us to experience the emptiness and failure of our idols as a wake-up call, urging us to return to Him. When our idols fail us, it's an invitation to come back to the one who never fails, who never leaves us, and who provides everything we truly need. The lesson here is clear. Modern idols may take many forms, but they all lead us away from the only one who can truly satisfy the longings of our hearts. Just as Dagon fell, so too will our idols crumble under the weight of God's truth. The question we must ask ourselves is, what are the Dagons in our lives? What are we propping up, hoping they will bring us joy, fulfillment, or security, but that ultimately cannot deliver? As we reflect on this, let us turn away from those things and turn back to God, placing Him at the center of our lives, where He belongs. He alone is worthy of our worship, our trust, and our devotion. Thanks for watching, and God bless you.